Hi, I'm Rita McGrath with Columbia Business School. This is our Friday Fireside Chat, and I am just thrilled to meet virtually someone I've admired for a long time, whose work has had a big influence on many of our lives, my own included. And he's got a new book out called Conscious Leadership, which is a terrific read about sort of 40 years of changing the world in very digestible short pieces. So I can definitely recommend you get that. We'll be talking about the book through this hour. A couple of things to note. This is being recorded, so do not say anything you do not want appearing in the New York Times or being asked about by your mother. And we will be following along in the chat. If I can get to all the questions in this hour, we'll do that. If we can't, we'll follow up with you afterwards and position some of those things. So welcome. I'm so pleased that you could make the time to be here and chat about the book.
Thanks for inviting me on, Rita.
Absolutely. So I thought, just for those listeners who don't know the story, right? Because, for a lot of folks like my MBAs, right, by the time they became aware of grocery shopping, Whole Foods was already this, main event kind of company. And we took for granted access to organic and the fact that farms would treat animals humanely. I mean, a lot of the things that we now just completely think it's like the air, wasn't that way. It wasn't that way for a long time. So maybe just a 2-minute overview of the journey.
Well, what you said is true. So I'll give a little background on the journey for my journey and then the journey of Whole Foods. It'll take me maybe 5 minutes. So if we go back to like 1976, I'm a student at the University of Texas, basically just taking electives, courses I'm interested in, and auditing classes. I really never was really on a degree track. And I just was all about, I had a wide-ranging curiosity, and I was just intellectually exploring the world. And when I was about 23 years old, I moved into a vegetarian co-op, a housing co-op that was associated with the University of Texas. And I wasn't a vegetarian at that time, but I was interested in all things sort of counterculture. And that was in the air that we breathed in the middle 70s. And I thought I'd meet really interesting people in a vegetarian co-op. And I did. And I became a vegetarian. I had my food consciousness awakened. I learned about natural food. I learned about organic food. I learned about why I should be a vegetarian. I learned how to cook. In fact, I became the food buyer for the co-op. I really got into it. It was my food awakening, and I didn't know it, but I was on a journey that was to my higher purpose in life, and what was going to consume me and has consumed me for the since then, 44 years ago. And then I went to work in a small natural food store chain called Good Foods, the Good Food Company, back in 1977. And I remember I learned about retail. I really liked it. And I remember coming home one day to the co-op and talking to Renee, my girlfriend, who at that time was 19, and said, Renee, I think it'd be fun to open a store. We could do our own little natural food store. What do you think about that? And she said, I think that's a great idea. Let's do it. So we did. We opened a small natural food store in 1978 called Safer Way. Safeway, Safer Way. And on the first floor, we had this, it was a vegetarian store. It was very pure. We were very idealistic. We were vegetarian. We didn't sell sugar. We didn't sell white flour. We didn't sell caffeine. We didn't sell alcohol. And I mean, a little vegetarian cafe on the second floor. And Renee and I moved out of the co-op, and we lived literally in the store on the third floor of this big house. And the thing is, we were so pure that we managed, and we didn't know what we were doing. We had no real business background. My resume is a very weird resume. And didn't take all those electives I took. None of them were business classes. So anyway, we raised $45,000. We lost half of it in the first year. We lost $23,000 in the first year. But we began to figure it out. I was reading business books. I've read hundreds and hundreds of business books and leadership books and everything. So I was on my own MBA program, just self-taught. And we made a lot of mistakes, but then after 2 years, we decided we made a profit the second year and relocated the store to a bigger location. And we merged with another natural food store that we were sort of friendly competitors with. And we changed the name to Whole Foods Market because they didn't want to be named our name and we didn't want to be named their name. So we compromised with a new name called Whole Foods Market. And that store was unbelievably successful. We changed the standards. We started selling meat and seafood, and we began to sell alcohol and coffee and sugar, but we were still selling natural and organic foods. It was still very pure, but not as pure as we were. We had, you might have said, our idealism overshot where the market was ready to hear at that time in 1978, 1979. Anyway, Whole Foods Market became the highest volume natural food store in the United States within just a few months of opening. We put it in a great location. Austin is even though it was much smaller back then, it was still a very hip university town, and it just took off. Our store was very successful. We had a flood 9 months after we opened that store up that wiped our store out. We had 8 feet of water in the store. Renee, the co-founder, my girlfriend, she swam out of the store that night because she was closing it down. And that led us to open a second store. I also learned about stakeholders because we should have died. We did not have flood insurance, and we were bankrupt. But our stakeholders, we didn't have that language back then. Our friends, our neighbors, our customers, our employees, our suppliers, our bankers, our investors, everybody pitched in to not have Whole Foods Market die. And that taught me something about how there's a larger system here that we're all sort of part of and interdependent of. And that was my first inkling of stakeholder theory before I had the language for it. Anyway, we got back open, we took off right where we left off. And then we opened a second store, which was successful, and then a third store. And then we kept doing that, and we ran out of money and out of retained earnings, took venture capital money in 1988. And that enabled us to expand out of Texas. We went to California and we went to New Orleans. And we acquired a small 2-store chain in North Carolina in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area. Durham area, and that was successful. And then we decided we needed more money. The venture capitalists wanted to do another round of financing, but that would have given them control of the business, and there was no way I was going to let the VCs take control of the business. So we did an IPO back in 1992. It was very different in venture capital reality back then, and a very different IPO market. Whole Foods Market, I mean, I was thrilled after the first day. Whole Foods, we were about close to 100 million in sales when we went public. And after the first day of trading, we were valued at, I don't know, about $80 or $90 million market cap, which for me, that was unbelievably good. I'm sure if Whole Foods went public today, it would have been a billion plus market capitalization out of the gate. But different time, different era. But anyway, with that capital from the IPO, Whole Foods Market was able to sort of begin to roll up some of our friends that were doing similar things to Whole Foods in different parts of the country. We got Bread and Circus in Boston area, and Mrs. Gooch's in LA, and Fresh Fields in Washington, Unicorn Village in Florida, and eventually Wild Oats and others. And they enabled us to create platforms that enable us to expand regionally around the country. And then now we start to get discovered by the media, particularly after we went to New York. So now we're about 20 billion in sales, 520 stores, thereabouts. We're still growing rapidly. As people know, we merged or were acquired by Amazon 3 years ago, just a little over 3 years ago, we closed that deal. And yeah, that brings us up to date.
That does. Well, thank you. Thank you. That's a breathless trip through history. But I think it's important to recognize some of the things that Whole Foods taught all of us, right? That there actually was a market of people who were prepared to pay for high quality food, that there was demand for it. And there was a lot of education, I think, that goes on. And I know you've recently been quoted as saying that there's just this real lack of knowledge of what we should be eating, how we should be eating. And it gets mixed up with the profit motives of firms that are quite happy with leaving people pretty ignorant, you know? And I think it would be difficult to overstate the impact that Whole Foods has had over that period.
Thank you. Maybe I'll add a little color to what you just said. So when we got started, it was not when we raised venture capital money, we mostly got turned down, although we were profitable and successful and growing pretty rapidly. But I remember one venture capitalist turning me down, and for some reason he felt he needed to tell me why he wasn't going to invest. And he was very, very honest. And he said, John, you guys are just a bunch of hippies selling food to other hippies. That is not a very big market. How big can that get? And if you try to grow bigger, you're not going to be able to compete with Safeway and Albertsons and Kroger. Those guys are going to put you out of business. And the follow up on that story was about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years later, I ran into him in a conference. He said it was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. It was not investing in Whole Foods. But what happened with Whole Foods, the reason we broke out, I think that we caught a wave that was moving in this direction. So that always helps if you're an entrepreneur. You have to, if you're in the wrong business, then if you're too far ahead of the times, then you're not going to be successful. But if you're too far behind the times, you're not going to be successful. Part of it's catching the wave right, and then also helping to grow the wave. In our case, Walmart was expanding supercenters back when Whole Foods was getting started. If you go back and look at the history, there's a correlation between Whole Foods opening and Walmart opening supercenters. And Walmart scared the conventional supermarkets so much with their low prices that all of them began to change what they did. They were trying to cut their cost. So that their stores, they invested less capital in their stores. Their stores got to be more warehouse. They looked more like warehouses, and their produce quality went down. And they were just trying to compete on price. And
well, like A&P was a victim of that, right?
Yes, absolutely. And there were many other. I mean, the number of failed businesses along the way have been enormous. So, but what happened is Whole Foods wasn't trying to compete with Walmart on price. We had a completely different product mix. But we want to make our stores really beautiful and give great customer service. So we were kind of going the opposite strategy. And we began to break through out of sort of our counterculture hippie roots when we started noticing all these basically middle-aged women coming into our store driving Volvos and
guilty as charged.
and they shopped our store not because they were interested necessarily in the natural food organic revolution we're doing. We just had really beautiful stores. And our team members, they might have had long hair and they might have had some tattoos and piercings, but they treated people really nicely. And so they just liked coming into our stores because the produce was good, the meat was good, the seafood was good. And we slowly began to break through, you might say, to the more mainstream middle class. And then that just gained momentum over time. But I always say one of the reasons Whole Foods has been so successful was Walmart sort of is like, it scared everybody so badly that they took all the air out of the room, and it enabled Whole Foods to not be competed with directly for a long, long time. We flew under the radar. We were just taken for granted for so many years. For I'd say the first 20 years of our existence, we were not taken seriously by supermarket competitors. That gave us a long runway to build up our store base, build up our supply chain, improve our operations, and so when the competitive onslaught came, we were far better prepared for it.
That's a really interesting story, and I think it gets at one of the things we don't talk about enough in strategy, which is, you're part of this ecosystem, and there are other players out there, and what they do, has a systemic effect. So one of the things that you opened the book with is this story about how now, I'm an innovation scholar, right? And the thing you should do, right, is you go after the new small thing before it becomes the big thing. And in this case, it was going after the Dotcom era, internet to come. And you open the book by talking about how it hadn't gone really well and that you needed to sort of head back home and right the ship, and some of the lessons that you learned that actually was the genesis of this whole theory almost of conscious leadership.
Right.
And I'm so interested in that. Like, what lessons did you take from that not so pleasant experience that allowed you to come back to Whole Foods almost with fresh eyes?
So the background on that for the people watching and listening is when the internet, the history of it is you have Netscape does this first, browser after Mosaic, and people started discovering the internet, and it started to grow, and the World Wide Web got invented, and then you started to have this boom of startups like Amazon,
Okay.
but not just Amazon. Lots of other Pets.com. There was this big race for real estate. It was like you got to get the URL, the generic URL, Pets.com, drugstore.com, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we thought, once you tried the internet, it was like if you're not asleep, it's like, oh my God, this is going to totally transform the world. There's no question about it. And so we jumped in. We bought a vitamin company that was a mail order, a catalog company that was based in Boulder, Colorado. And I identify as an entrepreneur, even though I've been building Whole Foods for 42 years now. I identify as an entrepreneur, and so I thought, you know what, I'm going to move to Boulder, and I'm going to take charge of this .com effort because it'll be fun. And that's what we did. My wife and I moved to Boulder back in 1999, and we had it first WholeFoods.com, but we decided to change the name. Probably not a good decision, to WholePeople.com. Our slogan was Whole Foods, Whole People, Whole Planet. So we thought we're going to be WholePeople.com, and we had a eclectic website, and it was a good idea. We were just way ahead of our time, and you couldn't buy the office. There's no Shopify. There was nothing you could buy sort of, no plug and play technology back then. Everything had to be custom built. It was enormously expensive and not very functional. We spent all this money on technology, had little to show for it. And then the only customers that were around back then were mostly tech people looking for free stuff, because the game back then was just try to get your sales and then sell out for some multiple of your sales.
Right.
Anyway, we took venture capital money in, and after a year, I realized this is not going anywhere. We should cut bait and just get out of this business. So we sold off what we had to a lifestyle company called Gaiam. And my wife and I moved back to Austin. But while I'd been gone, one of my senior executives had been placed in charge of Whole Foods. And, he didn't really want me to come back because he wanted to be the CEO. And I didn't know it, but because that business venture had failed, I'd made myself very vulnerable. And I had a couple of directors who didn't care for me as a leader. So there was a coup attempt which failed, and that's what we start out telling the book about. But the reason it's a good introductory story is because that was when I really started to wake up to conscious leadership. What I realized is that I had to do deep soul searching. How could this happen? Mm-hmm. Other than I made a mistake, an honest mistake that had the support of the board to go do this .com. Why is it that I had this coup on my hands? And I realized that I needed to grow as a leader, that I took a hard look at myself and realized that, like many entrepreneurs who have initial success, you can get arrogant, you can get overconfident. I was taking the board of directors for granted. I started the company. I hired those board members, and now they're going to try to fire me. Good grief, you got to be kidding. But hey, that's what happened. We were a public company, and they have fiduciary responsibilities to the shareholders. And Whole Foods stock was getting slaughtered during the whole .com debacle. So I was very vulnerable. I learned a lot of lessons from it. I learned the importance of our board, and it was important for me to develop close relationships of trust with the board. I realized that I needed to have, if I could have a long-term executive who was a 16-year executive, been with me for 16 years, try to depose me, I realized, wow, I don't even know my team that well. So I've got to become just more conscious, more awake. And that launched me really on this journey of becoming a more conscious leader, which is what the book tries to share, what I've learned, and also what my co-authors have learned over the last 42 years, but really focused a lot in the last 20, 21 years.
Well, it's interesting because when you hear, very often there's this arc, right? So like the Steve Jobs wandering in the wilderness for whatever it was, 7 years arc, you having this sharply discomforting experience, because I can't imagine that was very, I gotta believe there were a lot of sleepless nights involved in that.
Oh my God. I'm still trying to catch up on my sleep.
Right. But I think it's interesting that very often, if it's sort of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, like very often what we see is people who've been through that trial by fire come out of it with a very different view. Jobs is a very interesting guy to think about, because a lot of people take young Steve Jobs and they say that's the model for what leaders should be. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think he came through this awful experience and came out of it with something closer to what you're describing.
Yeah, Steve's one of my heroes, one of the great entrepreneurs, and maybe the greatest entrepreneur of my boomer generation. But there's some other good ones like Jeff Bezos, and Elon Musk, and there are many, but at the time, there's no question when Steve Jobs died, and Bill Gates, I left him out too. Steve was generally recognized as the greatest entrepreneur of this generation. And you read his biography, which I highly recommend, the one that Walter Isaacson did, really a great book. And, you know, Steve was a customer of Whole Foods. He shopped our stores, particularly our Palo Alto store. And, you know, our team members did not like Steve Jobs. Because he was a very arrogant guy and he treated them not very respectfully. And, but he did mature and evolve over time. I do think sometimes the best way to learn and grow is to get sort of a near-death experience, not a death experience. You don't cross over, but a near-death experience. Like I had a near-death experience. Steve, he was out of the company he created, Apple. He was pushed out, right? I mean, he had a coup. He had a coup. His guy, John Scully, that he hired, handpicked. He won. I won I pushed back on my coup, but Steve lost. But that ended up being a really good thing for him. Because, I mean, you know, Pixar came out of that. Steve was obviously an incredibly creative guy. And when he came back to Apple, he came back with a new maturity, a new wisdom. He was more fully empowered. He wasn't just the brash young man who wanted to, you know, to be provocative and shock everybody. And then you look what Apple did under Steve was, you know, it's just amazing what they accomplished in a pretty short period of time. So, yeah. I do think setbacks, as I say in the book, or we say in the book, one of your best opportunities to grow in life is through a crisis. Because when we're in a crisis, the general reaction most people do is to kind of contract, to try to look for a safe place, to go backwards, to regress, someplace safe. And that's a bad strategy. We should do exactly the opposite. A crisis is an opportunity to open your heart wider because the universe is trying to show us something if we will wake up and listen to it. We're getting hit over the head. The Buddha's cracking us over the head. Wake up, wake up, wake up. So wake up. And then you can accelerate your growth tremendously. So that's the best way to think about a crisis. I think Steve Jobs did that. And I think my crisis, I've had many crises at Whole Foods, but that one was definitely a wake-up call for me.
Absolutely. So if we go back to Whole Foods, the sort of, I'll say the before and after Whole Foods. So you pointed out that people kind of weren't paying attention for the first 20 years or so. But I'm reminded of something that one of my previous guests, a guy named Jim McKelvey, had said. And he wrote a book called The Innovation Stack. And he talks about the reason that it's so hard to for other people to copy these entrepreneurial success stories is that you're solving this multitude of problems, which are all kind of deeply nested in one another. And so somebody could copy the wide aisles, somebody could copy the logo, somebody could copy, we'll buy our apples from the same guys, but it's the gestalt that you can't copy that.
I say it's the culture.
Yeah, okay.
Because the culture is that gestalt, and that is the intersection or the interdependencies of all those relationships. It's the intellectual capital, it's the emotional capital, the spiritual capital the organization's developed. You can only copy the surface. You cannot copy the interior of it. That interior is reflected in the culture. And that's, a lot of people make that mistake, actually.
Yeah, they say, well, if this is working, I'll just do this. This is the best practices fallacy, right? Like, you know, well, if it works for them, it'll work for me. I'll just plop it in here. And I keep telling people, you know, if you want to be a Whole Foods, let's say, you're going to have a certain set of consistent choices that you make versus, say, a Walmart. You know, and if you're Walmart, you know, the furniture in your your reception area is leftover plastic prototypes that a supplier was trying to palm off on you. I mean, it's just a completely different kind of culture. So one of the things that I think is most sort of a theme really running through the whole book is this idea that you need to be navigating ants. And I think so much of both our conversation, our politics, our commerce, I see it in the business school all the time. Profits or purpose, you know, people or machinery, work practices or not. And yet throughout the book, you just illustrate all these examples of creating ants. And I'd love to sort of hear you expand on that idea.
Yeah, it's a very key idea. it took me a long time to realize that most people have, we interpret and experience the world through our frameworks, our little mental models that we have about the way the world is. And some of our mental models serve us well, and some of them don't, because they're too oversimplified. Mm-hmm. And one of the most common mental models that misleads people is the binary mental model of polarities that are opposites. So good versus evil. How many people interpret the world through a morality play where there's a good guy and there's a bad guy? We see this right now in our I don't want to talk about politics, but I'm going to say that we are very polarized in politics, and there's a tendency to be in a tribe. The whole polarity thing comes back from our tribal past, our tribal evolution, where our tribe is good and has good intentions. The other tribe is evil.
Evil.
It's Hitler. It's horrible. It's a monster. We have to stop it. And but the same thing happens in not just good versus evil, but we have sports metaphors where it's somebody wins and other people lose. And that's a very common metaphor we think about. Or we have war metaphors where we're trying to, defeat the enemy. Mm-hmm. And that's common metaphors used in business. We have light versus darkness, and masculine versus feminine. And these are all exaggerated. And that's what's happened with, I get asked all the time, like, well, how do you trade off between purpose and profits? Mm-hmm. It's like, I don't trade off because you don't have to trade off, because they're not opposites. They're a polarity that together you can create a higher synthesis from that. Higher purpose can lead to higher profits. Those are not opposites.
You use a great analogy in the book of red blood cells, right?
Yes, that's to give credit where credit's due. Ed Freeman, really the father of stakeholder theory, and a good friend of mine who's had a huge impact on me. Ed says, our body produces red blood cells. If we stop producing red blood cells, we'll die, right? But it doesn't follow just because we must produce red blood cells that's the purpose of our life, to produce red blood cells. Well, similarly, business has to make money. It has to make profits or it dies. But that doesn't mean that's the purpose of business, to make profits. Just like the purpose of my life is not to produce red blood cells. It's necessary, but it doesn't explain why it exists. So this has led to misunderstandings about stakeholder theory. Mm-hmm. And this, particularly now with the Business Roundtable, stakeholder theory has entered into the mainstream. And the media is completely misinterpreting it and misunderstanding it, in my opinion, because they're trying to jam it into a binary framework. You're either socially responsible or all you care about is you're greedy. All you care about is money. And they're trying to put it in a win-lose framework. So, now the investors, they've been getting more than their fair share. So now we're going to, the socially responsible company is going to make sure all the other stakeholders are getting more. Mm-hmm. And so it's still in this win-lose framework, except, the investors have been winning, and now we're going to make sure everybody else wins, or more people are going to win. And that's a misunderstanding of stakeholder theory, which is more of a systems theory. Mm-hmm. And the beautiful thing about capitalism, which people don't understand, because they think if somebody's getting rich, somebody else is getting poor. If somebody's prospering, somebody else is losing. The incredible thing about capitalism and about free markets is it's an interdependent system of multiple winners. They're all exchanging for the business for a mutual gain. There's very few losers in business, and the losers through competition don't even have to be losers themselves, because if competition is how you get better. Competition is how you strive to innovate, to become better at what you're doing so you'll be successful. But the customers are winning, or they wouldn't be trading with the business. The employees were winning, or they wouldn't be working there. The suppliers are winning, or they wouldn't be trading with the organization. The investors are winning, or they wouldn't have invested, or they would withdraw their money if they can. The communities are winning because jobs are being provided, taxes are being paid, donations are being given. And you have this sort of upward spiral. And that's why capitalism has been so transformative and has lifted humanity collectively out of the dirt. 200 years ago, 94% of everyone alive lived on less than $2 a day. Just think about that. That's now under 10%.
Mm-hmm.
So average lifespan was 30. Now it's 70, almost 73 across the world. Illiteracy rates were over 90%. It has been science, technology, and capitalism using those knowledge that we've gained to uplift humanity. It's not a win-lose system. And stakeholders is not a win-lose framework. It's a system. We have to manage the stakeholders so they're all succeeding, they're all winning. There's not a loser here. And so business is being misunderstood and stakeholder theory is being misunderstood. It's about investors don't make less, they make more. When you're optimizing the system so everyone is prospering and everybody's moving upward together, it's incredible. It's the most amazing thing humanity's ever co-created.
But there are arguments that we're out of balance. And, there's some very sharp people saying that the allocation of resources has been tilted in a way that doesn't allow that virtuous cycle to be perpetuated.
Well, so, those are the people I debate with.
Okay. Well, no, but I mean, you had a little brush with this yourself with Jana Partners, right? And, so I think there's a difference.
There's still evil in the world, and there's still greed and selfishness. Those have not disappeared. So they're always bad actors, but not just in business. We have doctors who are bad actors, and we have certainly many governmental people who are bad actors, politicians who are bad actors. Business, it's no different. There's greedy, selfish people in business, and so bad things happen. Mm-hmm. But that's not really what business is primarily about, because business is primarily about creating value for other people, particularly customers.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways, and I've read a number of interviews done with you, that people find puzzling, right, is you are an absolutely passionate defender of markets, and the freer the better. And at the same time, an equally passionate believer in treating people well. You finish your executive meetings with gratitude, appreciation. And I think for a lot of people, they find that hard to line up.
That's back to that binary framework, right? We're still thinking either or. If you're a defender of markets, then you must everything. You approve of everything. It's like, and if you've got this, you're either a capitalist or a socialist. I mean, it's binary. It's this framework that I think is that we've got to throw out. We got to toss this framework out. It's not serving people very well any longer. It's keeping us in tribal coalitions that are tearing our country apart. We need to look for win-win-win solutions, and we need conscious leaders in business, but we need them in government, and we need them in education. We need them in healthcare. We need them in the military. We need them everywhere that are thinking and strategizing to create these win-win-win-win solutions. So good for you, good for me, good for everyone, good for all of us. So, I mean, out of balance. I mean, markets are dynamic, but the reality is that there's an overall upward arc. There's a moral arc. We are becoming more conscious. We are evolving. Humanity is not stuck. When I think back, it just requires you have to just know history. You have to study history. We've made such progress, not just in the last 200 years. We made so much progress in my lifetime. In almost every way, the world is a better place than it was 50 years ago. That's why I always say, I always tell people they have to read Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now. I think it's the most important book written in the 21st century so far.
I have to confess, I haven't read it.
Well, if you do, you will, if you read it, you will probably never see the world quite the same way again.
I love books like that. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I think your book just
read it. Drop me a note after you do and what you think.
I will. Okay, I'll do that. So one of the things that is getting talked about a lot, right, is how do we create organizations in a world where it's very unpredictable and competitive dynamics can change at any time? How can we create organizations that are capable of self-reinventing? And so Reed Hastings and Aaron Mayer have a book just out on No Rules Rules and what they did at Netflix. And Netflix has the luxury of being able to say, well, we want high talent density and we're going to take these creative geniuses and let them loose. And I mean, that's a really different context than you deal with, I think, when you're running a grocery store. But some of the principles that seem to be the same really struck me. So at Whole Foods, the notion that you've got the teams that are to some extent self-managing, self-hiring, rewarded as a function of collective behavior. I'd love you to expand about how you came up with that idea and how does it work at scale? Because I mean, I could see it happening with 10 or 12 people you really like and respect, but to do that for, what is it, 100,000 people, that's a model that's hard to replicate.
Well, it's interesting. I do know Reed Hastings, and I'm reading his book right now. So,
are you? Huh?
Well, but I'm only read about 50 pages. But he does have a lot of different views than I do in that book. So I'm looking forward to it when I get a chance to talk with him about it. I mean, honestly, I came up with, teams. When I was reading widely in the early days of Whole Foods, Japanese management was all the rage.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Quality circles. Remember quality circles?
I do remember quality.
We were all going to sing songs when we came into work. It was all going to be like Kaizen principles. Absolutely.
Yes. So that had a big impact on me back in the early 70s and late 70s and early 80s. And Whole Foods adapted some Japanese principles into our culture. One thing about starting a new business is you're not locked into a culture yet. You are creating that culture as you go along. And you should do it in a more conscious way, I think, and take responsibility for it, because you can make a toxic culture or you can make a really healthy culture. And I sometimes say it's kind of like a garden. You got to pull up the weeds and you got to nurture the flowers so that you make a beautiful garden. But I will tell you, probably a big influence on me was I played a lot of competitive basketball. And honestly, what I saw, the teams that won in basketball were the teams that were very unselfish, that passed the ball around, and the person that had the best shot got the ball, and and people play hard defense, and it was one for all and all for one. And when you do that, you're pretty much very difficult to beat. And so I thought about that type of framework is I was happiest when I was playing on a team that was unselfish, and there wasn't a ball hog, and we were all working together to win. And so we broke in, take that plus the Japanese thinking. It was like, let's create teams, grocery team, produce team, specialty team, front end team. And these teams will be self-managing, but the team leader of those teams will be part of the store team. So Whole Foods Market consists of interlocking teams. Everybody at Whole Foods is on a team. And the leaders are on multiple teams because the teams all roll up to teams all the way up to the very senior leadership of the company. And that gives a real clear promotional scale as well. How to move up in the organization.
Gotcha. Okay.
But it also teaches people teamwork. And if people aren't good team players at Whole Foods, the culture sort of acts as an immune system and begins to select them out. And by the way, that's a good way to think about a culture. A healthy culture is like an immune system, and it attracts its own kind and it repels those who are too dissident. It can tolerate some dissidents, but too much threatens the integrity of the culture. So
I'll never forget this, learning about this when I was teaching in our MBA program. And one of our MBA students went off to work had a summer internship with Disney and came back like totally disillusioned. She's like, oh my God, it's all like Mickey Mouse and guests and, and kumbaya, and we're all singing. And she subsequently took a job at, I think it was Marvel, whatever the precursor to the current, but this Universal Studios, like totally different. And they were, cutthroat and snappy talk and snarky, and, and she loved it. That was great. That was a much better fit for her. And I thought, two perfectly high performing, very solid companies, but totally different culturally.
Well, that's one of the big questions with Whole Foods and Amazon. We've got cultural overlap, and yet there are distinctive parts of the culture that don't fit that well together. And so the challenge and the ongoing challenge is, how does Whole Foods integrate as well as we can into Amazon while preserving the unique aspects of our culture that make us who we are? And that's why I oftentimes use the metaphor of a marriage when you do a large merger, because in a happy marriage, I've been married 30 years, happily married for 30 years. And if you change when you get married. And if you don't change, you won't stay married. And particularly if you're a man, you won't stay married. That's
the personal improvement aspect of today's webinar.
I've been my wife's major project for 30 years. I tell you that there's a long way to go. But you are going to change in a good merger. And Amazon's not trying to force change on Whole Foods. But we're evolving because we're taking on aspects of Amazon that we admire and that help us are making us better. And that's having ripple effects through the culture. But there are other things about Amazon that we are pushing back on because we see that's a bridge too far. We can't go that far. We'll lose who we are. So it's kind of like in a good, healthy relationship, there's a me, there's a you, and there's an us. Mm-hmm. And all three have to be healthy. So when you're acquired, you have to decide which part are you willing to give up to be the larger part of the us, and which part you can't give up because then you won't be yourself any longer. So I think companies face this. And I think what generally happens when mergers don't work is the acquired company basically just like the Borg in Star Trek, just completely assimilate the other company and destroy the unique identity. And a lot of the value that they want to get, they'll lose the best people when they do that, they leave. And the unique elements of the culture disappear. And I would say Whole Foods did 23 acquisitions in our history. So I've been on the other side of these a lot of times. And what I've always seen is, I always say we always tried to inject the DNA of Whole Foods into the acquired, what was meaning our higher purpose, our core values, and our major leadership principles. And other than that, we didn't try to change them. We realized they were going to add value. They were going to make us better because they were doing some things better than us. We wouldn't wanted to buy them in the first place. Mm-hmm. So that's enabled Whole Foods to evolve. So the acquired companies affected Whole Foods mm-hmm. as much or almost as much as those that we affected. So like in a healthy marriage, you're both learning and growing together. Mm-hmm. And the us that you create, the we that you create together, the shared self is healthy and dynamic. Mm-hmm. That's a challenge in mergers. I just don't think most people go about it very consciously.
I don't think they start with that emotional level setting. So I would love to talk for just a bit, because you talk about it in the book. So Jana Partners turns up, and I see this, by the way, like dozens and dozens of times with the companies that I work with. Mm-hmm. A financially motivated investor turns up, is allowed to, try to change the direction of a target company. And that obviously is something you really need to think about. And you have some great points in terms of the thought process you went through. So one was, well, do we win do we win, but actually we're losing our soul and we're going to be distracted, and it's not going to be, when we come out the other side of whatever this is, it's not going to be who we want to be. And then the kind of search for what could be a win-win solution. And I thought that was such an interesting thing to sort of be a fly on the wall, listening as you thought your way through that. And then saying, what about Amazon? Why not? I mean, shared customer centricity, shared many things, and they have tech, which you.
Yeah, I do tell the story in there, and the story goes something like this. So, and I think this is an operating flaw, you might say, in capitalism, if we're going to use that type of metaphor, that short-term shareholder activists can take a company that's in a very short period of time and basically sell it.
Oh, yeah.
Because in our story, Whole Foods, we began to be copied. Our success. Remember how I said we flew under the radar for first 20 years of our existence? Well, we stopped flying under the radar and we started getting more competition. That's why capitalism works. That's a good thing. Mm-hmm. And they copied a lot of our marketing. They got more of our products in, and they began to try to undercut us in price. So the whole paycheck metaphor came out there at that time. And over time, as we got more and more competition, our same-store sales began to slow down and our stock price began to drop. And that didn't happen for very long before we got shareholder activists. And I met with them, our team met with them, and they said, we're going to take over your company. So it wasn't even about, we want you to make these changes to get better. They said, we want to get rid of your board. We want to replace the management team, and we want to sell you to the highest bidder. And we're going to win. So you might as well did you save us all a lot of time and money if you would just put yourself up for sale right now?
Jeez.
I know it was. If I would wish I had have taped the that first meeting, but Yeah, we didn't want to do that. And we looked at all of our we looked for the win-win-win solution. What is the win-win-win solution? What is the best thing for all of our stakeholders here? And we thought, well, one thing we could do is fight Jana. Let's engage in a war with them.
Right.
We actually developed an entire strategy to struggle for control with them. Secondly, we thought, well, if we could sell to a friendly hands, somebody like Warren Buffett, who would provide wisdom and guidance, but we'd hands off. And we actually contacted Warren, and he wasn't interested.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was like we could go private, and we could find private equity partners and take a lot of debt on and take the company private, get our prices down, get ourselves in a strong competitive position, and take it public again.
Kind of like what Michael Dell had to do.
That's exactly right. Michael Dell. I know Michael. He lives in Austin, and
of course, yes. I hadn't even thought of that. Mm-hmm.
Well, Michael actually, he's younger than me. We grew up in Houston. He went to the same high school. We went to the same high school, so there's some overlaps there. And anyway, and Michael's been his going private was wonderful. It's been wonderfully successful. So. That was a strategy not taken, but we did seriously consider that. Our main problem with that was we were going to have to take on over $10 billion worth of debt. And that risks the whole company. If you could go bankrupt. You think about
private equity in retail, it's in a bloodbath.
On $10 billion worth of debt is huge.
Yeah.
So a lot of retailers have gone bankrupt when they've taken that debt on. They're littered with it, actually. Mm-hmm. Including a lot of department stores and Toys R Us and many, many others. Anyway, we decided not to go down the path, and we didn't know what to do. And I remember waking up one morning, and I'd been asking this question over and over again: what's the win-win-win solution? And I just woke up and I saw it. I woke up, first thing I thought about Amazon, and I jumped out of bed. I said, Amazon, my God, why didn't I think of this before? I had met Jeff Bezos a year before in a Microsoft CEO Summit conference. He and I'd had a good conversation. Obviously, think he's a brilliant guy. We talked about books and science fiction and scuba diving and all kinds of stuff. Jeff's he's a good guy. And so we contacted Amazon and to see if they were interested. They said, yeah, come on up. We met with Jeff Bezos and his team on a Sunday, very secretive meeting. And I always say when you fall in love, at some point you'll have the conversation where you realize this could be the one. We had that conversation the first day. We talked for 3 hours about all the things we could do together if we partnered up. And we left there super excited. Our team was excited, and Amazon followed up almost immediately and sent a team to Austin the next week. 6 weeks after that first meeting, we signed a merger agreement.
Wow.
And so it happened very fast. And
I was going to say, in a normal company, you can't get the lawyers in the same room in 6 weeks.
one of the first things I learned about Amazon, they move really fast, really fast. And they got a lot of money. So if the lawyers don't want to move that fast, they get other lawyers.
Right. So as we're coming up to kind of the end, I'd love to get your perspective. And there have been some questions in the chat on kind of whether groceries, right? I mean, you've been public saying the shopping experience is highly likely to change. You know, we've trained a whole cohort of people that maybe they don't need to troll the aisles of a grocery store. You know, we're shopping for more stuff at the same time. We're not lingering. And I wonder, you know, what do you think? What are some of those next waves we should be thinking about when we're thinking about just necessities like food and whatnot?
Yeah, you know, of course, I get asked this question a lot.
I'm sure you do. Yeah.
And I mean, Whole Foods, Amazon are working on things. So I just can't tell you what they are. But the supermarkets, grocery retailing is being reinvented. COVID has accelerated delivery, but it's all being subsidized now. People are getting free delivery for the most part, and companies are losing money on it. That will not be the long term. You might get a pickup for free, but delivery is going to have a cost to it. It's too expensive.
Yeah, it's very expensive. But
there are many other things that are happening that, I mean, when I talked to the first meeting with Jeff and we talked, and Amazon's basic attitude was help us reinvent grocery stores.
Well, they've been in groceries before. I mean, they've been flirting with
they've had Amazon Fresh,
yeah,
online deliveries, but I think they're opening up Amazon Fresh physical stores now. So Amazon believes, and Whole Foods believes in the omni-channel. So I will tell you where we're heading in the most general sense, Rita.
Sure.
Basically, 10 years from now, you're going to be able to get whatever food you want, wherever you want it, whenever you want it, and at a price that you're willing to pay. So the consumer is going to be the queen and the king. And that's the reality. That's what's going to happen. And those that don't keep up are like in every other area, will begin to fall away. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons Whole Foods wanted to merge with Amazon, it was a win-win-win for all of our stakeholders. And yeah, we thought it'd be fun to team up with one of the great companies in the world and help try to reinvent the grocery store experience.
Absolutely. One of the things I love about Bezos's philosophy is he says, people blather on about all the things that are going to change. He said, why don't we focus on the things that won't change? He says, I can't conceive of a conversation that somebody's going to have with me 10 years from now, where they say, oh, Jeff, I love Amazon. I just wish you'd charge me more and deliver more slowly. It's not going to happen. Right? And I think as a philosophy, that's very interesting.
I keep seeing all these chat things come up. Are there any final questions from the chat that you want to ask me that you see there?
There's Whole Foods and Waste. What are you doing there? And then a couple of questions about other concrete tips to create an organization that's based on love and not on fear. That's an interesting one.
Well, the waste one, that's one people are very interested in. But again, I think people think about food waste and they think about it from a morality play standpoint, like, food waste is bad. What are you doing to stop this bad practice? Mm-hmm. And I mean, no food retailer, every time you have waste, you're losing money. And there's no food retailer wants to have food waste. So every food retailer's trying to figure out how to cut its waste down. And if you think in terms of tonnage, food waste is pretty high. If you think about it in terms of a percentage of your sales, it's not very high. And that's because people don't realize, Whole Foods is doing $20 billion a year in sales, and our food waste is, it's in the millions, but as a percentage, it's very tiny. Mm-hmm. And every time we save $1 in food waste, that's $1 that is going to the bottom line, essentially. So every food retailer is motivated to cut their food waste. It's not a morality, ethical situation. But so I get framed it up that way, like you're doing something evil if there's food waste, when we're all incented to cut our food waste back. People waste. We know from the food waste chain that most of the food waste in the United States does not happen at the grocery store. It happens in your refrigerators at home. Yep. People throw away a lot more food than grocers throw away. Mm-hmm. And anyway, Amazon is actually helping Whole Foods with food waste because they brought statistical analysis to it. So we're measuring everything, comparing it between stores, charting it, and showing steady improvement at it. So that's the main thing. We're focused on it. We're trying to cut it back. We're measuring it and we're rewarding it when we make progress.
So I'm going to ask two more questions. So let's think about that, how you create this positivity among the team, because I think that's something a lot of people are hungry for. And then how do people learn more? Obviously they can get the book. This is what it looks like, everybody. I've got all kinds of dog ears and things in it because I found it a terrific read. How do we create better, more psychologically safe organizations? And then how do people learn more?
Well, it's the cultures that we create. But the secret to the cultures we create is, first, you start with whatever your higher purpose is. And it has to be an authentic higher purpose. You can't just hire a consultant to tell you what your higher purpose is. It has to be something that is within the DNA of the organization. So it starts with your purpose. Then it's about your core values. What are the values that you're building your business around? And you have to walk that talk every single day. And people have to hold you accountable that you're living up to your core values. And then I learned this one from Amazon, because Amazon has leadership principles. Mm-hmm. And one of the things Whole Foods did is we studied Amazon's leadership principles. They had 14 of them. We took 10 of them in, and I call them, we Whole Foodized them. We put it in Whole Foods language. We got rid of 4 that we didn't agree with or didn't fit us. And we added 7 that were unique to us. And so and that's now we do cultural champion training at Whole Foods. And we a lot of that surround our higher purpose, our core values, and our leadership principles. We just became more conscious of our leadership principles. So if you Google Whole Foods market leadership principles, you can see what they are. There's 17 of them. And if you Google Amazon's leadership principles, you can compare and you can see where we overlapped. The most important thing I can say is, if you are the leader, you have to, if you're the CEO or the entrepreneur who creates an organization, you have to embody the purpose of the organization. You are the purpose. And just like children model after their parents, organizations model after their founders, the good things and the bad things. The things I love about Whole Foods are good qualities that I like about myself. The things I hate about Whole Foods are all my worst qualities, all magnified there. So we have to embody, and but this book, Conscious Leadership, is the answer to that question. To lead with love. To lead with love. Love is in the corporate closet. People are afraid of love. They think it makes you weak. Love is the strongest thing you can do in an organization. It's the glue that holds it all together. It's why Whole Foods has so little turnover, why we've been named 100 best company to work for 20 consecutive years. Love. We've unleashed it in our company. Finding win-win-win solutions, acting with integrity. It's thinking long-term. These are all the principles. In some ways, we've distilled down, me and my co-authors have distilled down 42 years of a lot of mistakes. You learn best from your mistakes.
Well, you're very honest about them in the book.
I made so many of them. How could I help but be honest?
Well, John Mackey, it has been a pleasure, an honor, a privilege to be able to chat with you about the book. I get the book. It's terrific. I learned a lot. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you do next.
Thanks, Rita. Thanks so much for having me on. And I hope we meet in the flesh someday on the other side of COVID.
Wouldn't that be great? Thank you.